Good morning, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm really excited to be talking about building pollinator habitat in cities and towns. As Rachel said, my name is Jessa Kay Cruz. I'm the Senior Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society, and I am based in Sacramento, California. For those of you who don't or aren't familiar with Xerces, our mission is to protect biodiversity through the conservation of invertebrates and their habitats. We've been around for about 50 years now, and we were named after the Xerces blue butterfly, which you see pictured here, which was one of the first invertebrates to go extinct due to human activities and habitat loss, and really highlighted the need for conservation efforts that were focused specifically at invertebrates. Our motto at the Xerces Society is protecting the life that sustains us, which is sort of our way of saying that we need pollinators and other invertebrates as much as they need us. And I'll talk a little bit more throughout this webinar about the services that insects provide for people, and especially for ecosystems, for healthy ecosystems. Just kind of giving you a little outline about what I'm going to talk about throughout the webinar today. I'm going to start with talking about the importance of pollinators and talk about pollinator declines, and then kind of move into a little bit more positive territory, talking about what you can do to help pollinators and other insects and some of the unique opportunities that exist in urban landscapes and towns and cities. From there, we're going to kind of get into the nitty gritty a little bit and talk about some of the habitat elements. So what does it mean to plant a pollinator garden? What are the components of that? How do you do that? And then sort of wrap up with some resources to help you sort of get started if you're inspired, which I hope you are, to do something, to do some planting or create some habitat, or some other kind of work to protect pollinators. We will leave time at the end for some Q&A. And if, as Rachel said, as questions come up, there is a little Q&A icon that you can hit and you can type your questions in, and Rachel will be helping me go through those at the end of the webinar. And I really do welcome questions and input from people. So to start out, I want to kind of just give a brief, sort of broad overview of the incredible importance of pollinators, both in our food systems as well as in our natural ecosystems. In our natural ecosystems, about 85% of the world's flowering plants require an animal, and it's usually a bee, but can be other insects as well, or even non-insects in some cases. But more than 85% of flowering plants require animal to move pollen, which allows that plant to produce fruit and to set seed. So in other words, to reproduce. The fruits and the seeds, for example, that are set by these plants as a result of pollination are an incredibly important source of food for many birds and many mammals. And insects themselves are an incredibly important source of food for wildlife, including 89% of the world's birds. Pollinator habitat is also compatible with the needs of other types of wildlife. So anything that you do to protect or enhance pollinator habitat is going to really enhance habitat for wildlife overall, as well as really providing a lot of other important ecosystem services. In our food systems, pollinators are also incredibly important, as I think you've probably all heard. Several years ago, Whole Foods Markets did this Share the Buzz campaign where they were trying to raise awareness about the importance of pollinators. So they took a normal produce section of their store that looks like what you see on the slide here, and they removed all of the pollinator dependent produce from their shelves. And this was what was left over once they had done that. I'm looking at that woman in the back with that empty grocery cart thinking she must be really upset and she picked the wrong day to shop. But what this translates to is 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food or drink that we consume required a pollinator. So that is really obviously incredibly important when we think about our diets and our food system. This picture, this was the cover of the New York Times a couple of years ago with this, really dire warning that the insect apocalypse is here. And the truth is that it is really dire and will have and already is having a huge impact on people and on our ecosystems. There was a study that came out that was kind of a compilation of a whole bunch of other studies looking at just insect declines around the world. And what that study found is that there was a 50% decline in insect populations over the past 75 years. So not only were we losing pollinators, which, I kind of talked about why pollinators matter, but also these other insect groups like natural enemies. So those are insects that prey on other insects, which kind of keeps our pest insect levels in check, right, through this natural predation. And so we're losing our natural enemies. Also our detritivores, so those are the soil dwelling insects for the most part that decompose dead material. They're incredibly important part of that sort of decomposition, recycling, and soil health. So we've got all of these different insect guilds that really play critical roles in our ecosystems, and all of them kind of across the board are in decline. Specifically, pollinators, of course, are really in decline. And just to give you a few statistics here specifically about pollinators, about 28% of our bumblebees are currently threatened, about 17% of all of our North American butterflies are considered at risk. And then probably the most heartbreaking for us here in California, I think a lot of you have heard about the plight of the Western monarch. And this has been a terrible, terrible year for Western monarchs, resulting in a 99.9% decrease in the population of Western monarchs since the 1980s. So we've gone from having literally well over 1 million monarch butterflies down to this year, we're looking at less than 2,000 monarch butterflies, Western monarchs remaining. So it's really, really dire. And I think the thing that's really most, frightening, I guess, about these insect declines is that it's not just the habitat specialists, so I think those are always the populations that are the most vulnerable, the real specialist populations that have really small niche habitats. So they're in decline, but also these formerly really common and widespread species like the monarch butterfly are also in decline. And I think that is particularly telling. There are a lot of factors that are contributing to pollinator declines, and all of these factors are interacting with each other. It's somewhat of a complex picture, but I will try to break it down to you for you in these sort of 3 major categories of factors contributing to pollinator declines. And that would be habitat loss or degradation, pesticides really playing a role, and also climate change. So I'm going to talk about each of those sort of individually. In terms of habitat loss or degradation, we've got what I refer to as agricultural intensification happening. And so that means that farms that once had at least patches or fragments of habitat or some kind of diversity are now becoming these monocultures. And we sort of have this fence post to fence post farming where we don't have those fragments of habitat left anymore in our agricultural lands, to speak of. And that's really a problem. And then on top of that, we've also got just overall land use changes. So population is growing here in California, and cities and towns and et cetera are really sprawling. And so we have intense urbanization happening, and a lot of natural areas are just being lost because of that. This statistic was really floored me. In California, between 2001 and 2011, our natural areas were disappearing at the rate of 1 football field every 5 minutes. So that is really fast and drastic changes in habitat and in our landscape. Pesticides, as I mentioned, are another really big piece of the picture when you're thinking about pollinator declines. And I think what is really telling is just how ubiquitous pesticides are in our landscapes. So several years ago, Xerces did a study in collaboration with the University of Nevada, Reno, and we took leaf samples from milkweed plants all over the state of California, from all of these different landscapes. We had backyards, city parks, roadsides, and agricultural areas. And every single leaf sample, when we sent these samples to the lab for analysis, every single leaf sample was contaminated with at least a couple of different pesticides. So that just demonstrates, again, how ubiquitous pesticides are. And how much they move through our landscapes. They're not staying where we put them. In a lot of these cases, there were no pesticides being applied anywhere close to these milkweed plants. So that, I think, is really telling and just really highlights the need to address pesticide use and its impacts on pollinators. And that study was done specifically on milkweed, as it's the host plant of the monarch butterfly, but I think it would probably translate to almost any type of plant. I think the other thing that's really important to highlight, especially in this webinar, is that, pesticides are not limited to agricultural use. I think a lot of people think about farming and agriculture when they think about pesticides. But on a per acre basis, we actually use more pesticides in urban areas than in a lot of agricultural areas. And urban use of pesticide is completely unregulated and unrestricted. And you can walk into a Home Depot today and buy an insecticide that has neonicotinoids, which are really toxic products, and you can apply that in your yard any way you want, off label, and there's almost no accountability. So that is really an issue, and just something to think about specifically in these urban and suburban areas. I also mentioned climate change as being a contributing factor. We're really just beginning to understand all these potential negative impacts of climate change on invertebrates, and it's complicated, but I kind of wanted to break it down into some major areas to think about when we think about climate and pollinators. So one factor is physiology. So we've got changes in temperature that directly impact pollinator survival, their growth, and their reproduction. Pollinators they're very temperature sensitive, and a lot of their cues in the different development of their life cycle are temperature cues. And when our temperatures change drastically, it really impacts makes some physiological changes for pollinators. We've also got range shifts. So as the climate changes, the distribution of species starts to change. There are some cases where their ranges are expanding, but for the most part, that is not the case. And these range shifts are overall having a really negative effect on pollinator populations and also other insects as well. We've got phenology, and so this is specifically the potential for a phenological mismatch between pollinators and their host plants. So pollinator life cycles are really tied in closely with either their direct host plants, for example, if they're butterflies that have host plants, or specialist bees, or even generalist bees that are just tend to emerge when food sources are available. And when the phenology starts to alter, there ends up with this mismatch between pollinators and the plants that they rely on, which is really problematic. We've also just got general changes in plant communities resulting from climate change. So the quantity and quality and diversity of our plant communities and natural areas is really changing, which again impacts pollinators because they have co-evolved with these plants and are dependent on these plants. We've got species interactions that are new species interactions happening as, again, there's shifts in ranges of these different insects. So we've got new predators and new pathogens that pollinators are contending with that they haven't co-evolved with. And then just all the combined effects of stressors from climate change, along with all the other things that I mentioned already, are all working together to have a really big impact on pollinator populations. So the question becomes then, obviously pollinators are in decline and they're in need of help. And what can we do to help? What can we do for pollinators? The good news is that there is a lot that we can do. And it's not hard, and really it's fun. Creating habitat is one of the most important actions we can take for pollinators. And even really small spaces can contribute to species conservation. And there's a lot of benefits. In addition to helping pollinators, creating habitat supports other types of wildlife, helps with carbon sequestration, with water infiltration, just so many ways that habitat is valuable, both for people, for pollinators, and for the planet. When I think about conservation in cities and in towns, I look at it as protecting biodiversity by modifying the places where we live and where we work and where we play. And I'll talk more about what I mean by that. But the really good news about looking at pollinator conservation in cities or in towns is that we can actually achieve some landscape level conservation and true connectivity. And that connectivity or those corridors, all of that is really important for pollinators as well as other types of wildlife. So what do I mean by that? This landscape level change. So I took this aerial photo, and this is actually my neighborhood here in Sacramento. Just seemed like a good example. And what you're seeing in this aerial photo is an area that's a little over a mile square. And within that area, we've got the American River that comes through. We've got a college campus, Sacramento State, got commercial buildings interspersed with residential areas, got a freeway cutting right through there. And we've got these city parks that are kind of dotted all over, these different neighborhoods. So how do you take all of these different sort of disparate areas and create habitat and create some connectivity? What does that look like? So full disclaimer, these photos are examples of what could be done in these areas. These unfortunately are not all the specific areas that I showed you on the aerial photo. I wish that I had had that much impact in my neighborhood, but I'm working on it, but I'm not there yet. So again, these are examples of what could be done. But first and foremost, I wanted to talk about riparian habitat. A lot of cities and towns have major waterways or rivers, streams, lakes, whatever, but especially moving water coming through. And these riparian areas provide really critical corridors and have the potential to provide great connectivity for pollinators and for other types of wildlife. So if I had to choose which landscape to work in first, I was thinking about conservation, especially for pollinators, I would really be looking at riparian areas first and foremost. And, all wildlife depends on water. So anything that you can do next to these water sources is going to be really impactful for pollinators. Moving on to talking about commercial buildings as an example. And this is just slide, it's just a great example of this concept of no space is too small. So this photo was taken outside an office building, I think in Madera. And this area is only about maybe 5 feet wide by, I don't know, maybe 10 feet long. So it's a really small area, but boy, it was buzzing with pollinators and activity. So, even small spaces can be very impactful. And also really low water use. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later, but just always an important consideration, especially in California, where we're kind of in a perpetual state of drought. I mentioned college campuses. So we have a Xerces affiliated program called Bee City Bee Campus, which I'll talk about later, but it's an official designation. You can be designated Bee Campus by taking certain actions. So UC Davis, so that's in the next town over from Sacramento, University of California, Davis is a certified bee campus. And this is a photograph of one of their bee habitat areas on campus. And what I think is really significant about this is that when I had a conversation with the folks at UCD about the Bee Campus program, one of the things that they told me was that their grounds department reported to them that the maintenance costs actually decreased after changing their landscape from sort of this traditional landscape of, grasses and, neatly pruned hedges to a pollinator-friendly garden, such as the one that, is shown on this slide. And I think that's just really significant because, we live in the real world and time and money is always a limiting factor for people. So knowing that the maintenance costs actually decreased after they became a bee campus, I think is really significant. I mentioned roadsides. I mentioned the freeway that's in my neighborhood. So roadsides can provide they can be a really important resource for food and for shelter, as well as connectivity just by their very nature. And roadside habitat is a net gain for insects. I know people are always concerned about, the insects flying into the road and ending up on someone's windshield, which does happen, but not as much as you would think. And insects, generally speaking, and pollinators in particular, will stay in these vegetated areas and not really venture out into the road very often. So roadside habitat for insects really is a net gain. The other thing that's interesting about roadsides is that just doing things like changing the way that we manage them can really benefit pollinator habitat. So this is an example of, the Department of Transportation just changed how they mowed and when they were doing the mowing to allow this milkweed that was just growing naturally in the area to really be prolific and went from just a couple of scattered plants to this big hillside of milkweed. So sometimes something just as simple as, changing the way that you manage something can really do a lot for habitat. City parks present a great opportunity for pollinator habitat. It's beautiful. Pollinator head gardens are mostly comprised of flowering plants with some bunch grasses, very pretty. You can have interpretive signage and pathways and benches where people can sit down and, watch the bees, the butterflies, and the hummingbirds and that kind of thing. So, focusing pollinator gardens in city parks is just a really great way to get people engaged and involved and enthusiastic. And finally, just again, no space is too small. So, something like this sort of strip, this parking strip between the sidewalk and the street is just another opportunity to get some habitat on the ground. And then my personal favorite thing to talk about are yards. The slide just makes me laugh every time I see it. It's a kind of classic cookie cutter yard and housing development in San Jose. It's so typical, I think, of a lot of our California landscaping. And, this type of yard with this vast strip of well-manicured lawn grass, it does absolutely nothing for wildlife. It does not provide really any habitat for any type of wildlife at all. So this picture just kind of shows a transformation from your stereotypical, lawn grass yard to a full-fledged pollinator garden. Full disclosure, this is my house. And when we moved in 2013, sort of the middle of our really, really severe California drought, pulled out all that lawn grass, took out the lawn sprinklers, created this pollinator garden with some native plants as well as some really drought tolerant non-native plants, put everything on drip irrigation. And that year, we had watering bans. And so people weren't allowed to use their lawn sprinklers, and all of our neighbors just had these dead lawn grass in front of their yard all summer long, just brown. And then, that looking at my yard with all the, flowering plants that we had on drip, it just really shows the impact. And we looked at outdoor water use when there were lawn sprinklers compared to after we had put our pollinator garden in, and our water use went down by 90%. So we were using so much less water and then getting all of these great benefits from having a pollinator yard. So just on the water conservation level alone, it's just something to think about. So again, now just kind of zooming back out, thinking about the potential, this again is only a mile square. And if we had all these residential areas and parks and riparian areas and campuses and everybody else doing some of these things, we would be making landscape level changes here. And there would be some serious connectivity and habitat for pollinators and for other types of wildlife. So now I want to get a little more into the nitty-gritty and talk a little bit about the specific elements of pollinator conservation. And to conserve pollinators, I think we first just need to understand their diversity and what comprises a pollinator garden. So first of all, just incredible diversity in the world of pollinators. There's about 3,600 different species of bees that are native to the United States. We've got over 800 species of butterflies in North America. And then we've got this incredible diversity of all of these other flower visiting insects, like beetles and wasps and flies. And of course, the soil dwelling insects that I talked about more. So just incredible diversity in the world of insects and pollinators. And honestly, whether you're working in the backyard or, as we say, the back 40, pollinator habitat is really comprised of the same elements. And I'm going to talk about each of these individually, but those elements would be food, which is basically pollen and nectar, and then host plants for butterfly. Shelter, and that would be primarily nest sites and overwintering sites. And then protection especially from pesticides and also from other types of disturbance. Those are really the key elements of pollinator habitat. And then just thinking broadly about supporting the diversity of different types of pollinators throughout their life cycle. That's really what we're thinking about. So talking about food for pollinators and pollen and nectar, plant selection is obviously really important. It's key. I like to emphasize focusing on native plants. Our native pollinators have co-evolved with these native plants. So they are really the best plants to put in to support these pollinators. I do mix in some non-native plants as well. And I think in a yard or urban landscape, I think that's fine to do, but just keeping the emphasis on natives. Selecting plants with high pollinator value. So not everything that blooms is good for pollinators. Generally speaking, avoiding bedding plants or things that have been really hybridized. And again, sticking with native plants or with heirloom varieties, there's going to be much more attractive to pollinators. Here in California, I always emphasize drought tolerance. So selecting plants that don't need a lot of water. Also fire resistance, right? That's something we think about more and more. We've had some really brutal fire years these last couple of years. And so, thinking about defensible space close to your house, especially in these sort of suburban, rural sort of interface areas where fire safety is really important. And there are some plants that are much less flammable than others. Thinking about long season bloom, right? Providing habitat and providing bloom for pollinators from really early in the spring, really from late winter all the way into the fall. Our winters in California are very short, and insects are active, all the rest of the year. And honeybees are active year round. So just having bloom out there throughout the seasons is really important. Including butterfly host plants is really nice to do when you're thinking about a pollinator garden. And then of course, protecting those areas from pesticides is super important. We have some really detailed, well-researched plant lists for different regions of California. I put the link up right up here. I think Rachel's going to try to put that link in the Q&A box so you guys have access to that. But I really encourage people to just take a look at those plant lists because there's a ton of information, including things like drought tolerance, fire resistance, which plants are butterfly host plants, all of that. As I mentioned, that season-long bloom is really important. And so the next set of slides are just some of my general recommendations and some, examples, again, for California gardening in particular. And again, full disclosure, this is my yard. So this is an example of some spring blooming plants. We've got golden currant or ribes here in the foreground and lupin, a bush lupin in the background. Other great spring blooming plants for pollinators in California include Oregon grape, California poppies, of course, Ceanothus, which is also referred to as California lilac, and manzanita, another really good one for pollinators blooming very early in the spring. Moving on to summer, our summers are pretty long and can be very hot. This plant here in the foreground is one of my favorites. It's called Monorodella or coyote mint. And then in the background, there's some salvia. Salvias are excellent. Mostly summer blooming plants here in California. California buckwheat is another fantastic plant, extremely rugged and heat tolerant. There's a lot of different species of buckwheat out there. Again, if you wanted to mix in some non-native plants, things like lavender are really good summer blooming plants as well. And then fall can be a little bit challenging, especially here in the Central Valley where I live, because falls can be very dry and very hot. The rains don't come till pretty late, and a lot of people's gardens start looking kind of sad in the fall. And this is where I think actually we have the greatest deficit in our landscapes overall of pollen and nectar for our pollinators. So definitely focusing on fall blooming plants is really important. So on the slide, we've got some Salvia greggii in the front, which is non-native, not native to California, but it does extremely well here and will bloom readily all the way through the fall. We've got a pomegranate in the background blooming there. And, as well as having food for pollinators, I like to have food for people in my garden. And things like fruit trees and berries provide great pollen and nectar resources for pollinators, as well as, of course, great food sources for people. So yeah, just think about that. And really just most fruit trees, that including citrus, that's probably true for. Kind of in the background here, just coming into bloom, there are some California fuchsia or epilobium, which is another fantastic fall blooming native California plant. We've also got goldenrod and aster, two very important fall blooming plants here in the state. So yeah, so it can be done. Also, I've mentioned a couple of times butterfly host plants. And so, the larvae of butterflies need specific plants to feed on, to grow and develop. For monarchs, that is, of course, milkweed. And so I want to emphasize planting native milkweed is really important, specifically for monarchs. And milkweed not only will support monarchs, but it's a great nectar source for other pollinators. And are also one of the best plants for attracting natural enemies. So things like lady beetles or parasitic wasps or syrphid flies. My milkweed is always covered in lady beetles in the spring. I do want to emphasize, if you're planting milkweed, make sure it is native. There's a lot of issues with planting non-native milkweed in particular in California. So definitely stick with the native varieties. And then to wrap up the plant selection conversation, including native bunch grasses, super important. Bunch grasses are host plants for a lot of butterflies. They provide nesting and overwintering site, and then they have all these other great benefits like, improving water infiltration and sequestering carbon. And they're very pretty accent plants. So definitely don't forget about your bunch grasses. And then related to that, of course, providing nesting and overwintering sites is really important for pollinators. About 70% of our native solitary bees actually nest directly in the ground. So do think about protecting nest sites, avoid the use of heavy plastic or landscape fabric. Using light mulch and bark chips can be okay. And I do like to use some mulch because it keeps the weeds down and the moisture in. So just make sure it's something that bees can dig through. Um, Avoid tillage or ground disturbance because again, these bees are nesting down on the ground, so you don't want to be tearing up their nests. And pebbles or light rock might actually encourage nesting. I've also noticed I have these pathways in my yard that are all decomposed granite and the andrenids, which are also referred to as mining bees, seem to really love nesting in the decomposed granite. So it's kind of an accidental discovery, but seems to be really good for those ground nesting bees. And just remember that ground nesting bees are not aggressive. They don't defend their nests the way that like yellow jackets do, for example. So you don't have that same safety concern about encouraging them to nest down in the ground. There are a lot of pollinators and native bees that are also what we refer to as tunnel nesting. So they will nest either in the stems of pithy plant materials, which I'll talk more about, or in dead wood, tree snags, logs, stumps, even down in rock piles. And so this slide just shows a couple of examples of really attractive ways to get snags and logs and things into the garden. In terms of those pithy stemmed plants that I mentioned, you can kind of see in this slide, there's a bee nesting directly inside that stem. That's very common for a handful of bee species in this area. So planting things like cane fruit that has a pithy stem, also things like elderberry and California wild rose have great pithy stems that pollinators will use, and even asters. So again, just thinking about including these plants in your garden. And then finally, leave the leaves. That's our campaign. Lots of different insects will overwinter and take shelter sort of under the leaves down in the ground. So this just kind of gives you an excuse to be a little bit messy and don't rake your leaves, just let them stay. Also, as I mentioned a couple of times, pesticide risks. When you're purchasing things at the store, just thinking about finding out, were these, transplants treated with pesticides? Neonicotinoids are commonly used in all kinds of plant materials, horticulture plants. Sometimes you can actually see on the tag that they were treated, sometimes not, sometimes you have to ask. But neonicotinoids are systemic, they stay in the plant material for a very long time. So you don't want to probably be buying things that were treated with neonics and then planting them out in your yard because they could still be, have some level of toxicity. So again, like consumer pressure, I think it's really important here. And asking those questions from where you're buying your plants and trying to find things that have not been treated. And then once you plant things out in your garden, just a reminder of all of the different ways, these different exposure pathways with pesticides and the risks that are involved. So, we think a lot about direct contact. Obviously, if you spray and it lands directly on a bee, there could be toxicity. But it's also important to remember that a lot of bees and other insects use pieces of leaf or flower petals in the construction of their nest. And so you don't want them to be taking contaminated plant materials back to their nests. Then of course, with the ground nesting bees, you think about the nest sites being right down in the soil. Anything that, ends up in the soil could be problematic, and things like drenches, soil drenches as a way of applying the pesticide can be particularly problematic for our ground nesting bees. We've got, of course, indirect contact, and that would be where, maybe a flowering plant is sprayed, and then a bee comes along and forages on the pollen and nectar, which is now also contaminated. And that is definitely a problem. And then, of course, I mentioned neonicotinoids, so those are systemic. And that means they are absorbed into the vascular system of the plant and translocated from the roots of the plant all the way through the rest of the plant material. And some systemics like neonicotinoids, which is just a group of pesticides, a class of pesticides, those can stay present in plant materials for weeks or even months after an application. So that's another reason that they're, so problematic, is just their longevity. So just, this is just things to think about and be aware about as you're planning your pollinator gardens, whether those are in parks or public spaces or in your own backyard. So I want to make sure that I'm leaving ample time for questions. So I'm just going to wrap it up here by pointing you toward a couple of additional resources. As I mentioned earlier, Xerces has an affiliate initiative called Bee Campus, Bee City, or Bee City, Bee Campus, USA. And the mission of Bee City, Bee Campus is to galvanize communities to sustain pollinators by providing them with healthy habitat, with a variety of native plants that are as free of pesticides as possible. And this is a really great way if you want to think about landscape level changes. This is a great way to do it. I included the link here, bcityusa.org. We can provide you support with getting started, connect you with other bee cities that are already designated bee cities if you want testimonials or information about how to do it. But really, it's just finding somebody in your city council maybe who's interested or excited about the idea. And we have all sort of the resources of what it means to be a bee city all put together. And so we have bee cities and bee campuses all over the country. And again, this is just a great way to make a really big impact in your own community. So I really encourage people to check that out. Xerces also has some fantastic community science programs. We've got Bumblebee Watch and Bumblebee Atlas, which are great ways that you can get involved in specifically looking for and reporting bumblebees and contributing to our data sets there, which is really important. And then there's a couple of ways to get involved with tracking monarchs, both during their overwintering on the coast. Those would be the Thanksgiving counts, as well as, looking for monarchs out in their breeding habitat throughout the state. So I provided the general link here, Xerces Community Science. That link will link you up to all these other community science programs. And it's just a great way to get involved and contribute to some really important data collection. And then there's a couple other organizations. Monarch Joint Venture has some really great community science programs, as well as the Great Sunflower Project that is based out of San Francisco. So another really great program. We have so much information on our website. I really encourage people. I think the best way to find things is to go to our Pollinator Conservation Resource Center, specifically for California. I provided that link, but that has plant lists and just all kinds of other information that I think are really helpful for people. Pesticide mitigation, habitat implementation and management, et cetera. CalFlora and CalScape are great websites to find more in-depth information about specific plant species. And then if you want to find out information about pesticides and toxicity, I highly recommend Bee Precaution. Again, the link is here. It's a user-friendly, really simple way to query to get information about pesticides and toxicity to bees. And then the UCI, that's run by UCIPM, but then also the UCIPM general website is fantastic, has a lot of information about also non-pesticide pest management ideas and techniques for people. So I'm hoping, that some of these resources will really help some of you get started, or maybe you've already been doing this work and you want to do more. And I just want to wrap up by acknowledging all of our Xerces supporters. We could not do what we do without them, and most particularly our Xerces Society members. Membership to Xerces is very inexpensive. It is a great way to have an impact, especially if maybe you don't have a green thumb and you don't want to go out and plant a pollinator garden, but you do want to do something to help. Becoming a member is one of the most impactful things that you can do. And there's a lot of great perks that come with Xerces membership. So I really encourage people to check that out as well. And that is all I've got for you today. I just especially want to thank all of you for spending this hour with me today to talk about pollinators and talk about habitat. I know people are incredibly busy. And so it was really an honor to share my day with you or this hour with you. And we do have about 10 minutes or so for questions. So I will stop for a minute and let Rachel go through the questions. Feel free to continue typing questions into the Q&A as they come up. And yeah, I will open it up now for questions.
Okay, so I would say out of all of the webinars we've had throughout this series, these are probably the best questions we've had, and there's quite a few of them. So just to note, Jessa's email is on this page. I've also put it in the chat. If we don't get to your question, it's not because it wasn't a good one. It's just we're not going to have time to answer all of these. So please send her an email because these are such good questions. So we'll kick it off with the first one that came in. I understand that some open landowners are encouraged to sell their land to developers per price in local governments. Can you please speak to how such landowners can hold their ground and not sell?
Ooh, that is a great question. I don't have a lot of knowledge about real estate per se. If you are talking about working land though, so say for example, you're a rancher, there are programs through the NRCS, which is the Natural Resources Conservation Service, to help people hang on to, they do offer financial incentives to help people hang on to working lands and keep them working lands as opposed to undergoing development. So that is one thing to look into, because a well-managed ranch, for example, can be excellent natural habitat. If it's not working land, I think the other thing that I would recommend is looking for your local land trust or whatever the closest land trust there might be, because that's another thing that land trusts do is try to help people keep natural land or natural areas natural. So again, helping landowners sort of hang on to their land and maybe not have it undergo development. I also do want to acknowledge that, we do have a pretty severe housing crisis in California. And so I think it does need to be balanced. It doesn't seem fair to say, we shouldn't be developing anywhere at all. So a lot of it is sort of where we develop and also how we can develop. There are very sustainable ways to develop land and provide housing without completely destroying habitat. It's more expensive, but it can be done. And so that's just sort of another thing to think about. So yeah, sorry, I don't have more specific answers to that question, but I think, again, NRCS and Land Trust would probably be the best places to start thinking about that.
Okay, it is so hard to pick through all these questions, but I'm doing my best. So this one's interesting that will probably hopefully be a quick answer. Is Caltrans introducing more pollinator plants along the highways?
Yes, absolutely. And Xerces has been working specifically with Caltrans for a number of years, as well as more broadly with the Department of Transportation on a national level. And so there's definitely interest and will at Caltrans to do these projects and put pollinator habitat into roadsides, and it is happening. It just takes time and expertise and money and all of that. So it's a little bit of a slow rollout, but it's definitely happening. And I think anybody who has any connections to Caltrans, I really encourage people to keep reaching out to them and talking about this and asking about it, especially if there's areas that are being, slated for replanting or remanagement or development, is really worth doing.
Okay, great. This next question, do you have a list of growers that sell an abundance of native plants that are pesticide free?
We have a great list of nurseries in general, and that is on that Pollinator Conservation Resource Center link that I mentioned earlier. And there's a whole list of nurseries and native seed producers throughout California. The pesticide-free part is a lot harder. We're just starting to delve more deeply into our work with nurseries and addressing pesticides. And so we don't have that information yet, but it is something we're working on. Most nurseries use some kind of pesticides in the production of plants, and I've worked on the production end of things. I've worked in wholesale nurseries, and it is really hard to grow healthy plants without using any pesticides at all. And consumers often don't want to buy plants if they see, even aphids on them. So some of it is changing the consumer expectation. But some of it is also a little bit more nuanced. So it's finding out what people are using, and then at the very least, requesting from nurseries or finding out if they're using neonicotinoids or other systemics is really important. So unfortunately, at this point, we don't have a list per se, but I think it's more of a conversation that people can have with their local nurseries about what maybe has been applied. And again, it's something that I think we're working toward, and it's a complicated issue, but we're hoping to maybe have like a ranking system or something, where at least there's nurseries that are certainly more conscientious about pesticide use than others.
Thank you, Jessa. We do also have, I think you mentioned the publication, the Be Safe nursery plant publication that's coming out. And we have a specific webinar all about it on February 26th. And there's going to be 2 call to action days where we're actually going to ask people to go to nurseries and ask them specific questions and find out if they use pesticides to help build our database. So if you're really interested, that would be a good webinar to check out. And it's on our website, the same place that you registered for this one. I also put the link to the Pollinator Resource Center for California in the chat box that you were mentioning, Jessa. So this question I really appreciate because we are focused on urban habitat. Do you have any recommendations for those who don't have a yard but do have a balcony to provide pollinator habitat?
Oh, that's a great question. And, I'm sorry I didn't include that in this talk. I thought about it and I just was worried that I was going to go over time. But, even potted plants are a great way to provide habitat, and even just a couple of potted plants on your balcony can definitely support pollinators. So you just want to think about providing sort of the right size plant for the right size pot. And that's something that obviously just depends on the plant. But, just think about in general, the roots of the plant will go down as deep and as wide as the size of the plant at maturity. That is a very rough guideline. It varies by plant, but that's just something to think about. So obviously you can't put a large tree in a small pot, but you can put a blooming shrub or even, annual wildflowers like poppies and lupins in pots. And it absolutely is worth it and will still provide habitat. So when I say no space is too small, I mean that really literally. Even a single potted plant will do something. So yeah.
So this kind of goes along with that. Obviously, milkweed is a really important plant, especially in California for monarchs. And this person is asking, how is milkweed to be planted? If it's in a pot, how often do you water it in the summer? Do they totally die down in the winter? Someone also brought up the topic of tropical milkweed.
Okay, so in terms of just planting and caring for milkweed, it can be a little bit of a tough plant to get going, to be honest. I think that planting it in a pot is totally fine, as well as planting it in the ground. I think it would do fine. The frequency of irrigation is unfortunately really going to depend on whether it's in a pot or in the ground and where in California you live. Although milkweed is generally drought tolerant, it probably needs a little more water than a lot of native plants to get established. So, I think in my yard, when I was first getting it going, I probably gave it weekly water. It gets a lot less now and it does fine, but even in the hottest part of the summer, maybe slightly more than once a week. Just especially in that first year or two while you're getting it going. You can buy transplants, obviously, to plant in your yard. In some nurseries, you can also buy rhizomes. So kind of like you plant bulbs of, iris. I guess iris is technically also a rhizome, but or daffodil bulbs or whatever, the same way that you would plant those in the fall, you can plant milkweed rhizomes, and they tend to do really well from a rhizome just because there's so much energy stored in a rhizome. It's a good way to kind of get something going quickly. In terms of tropical milkweed, and so I guess the other thing I wanted to say about milkweed is it does go completely dormant in the winter. Sorry, not in the summer, in the winter. It will die back completely to the ground and disappear. People get alarmed when it starts to look bad in the fall. That's totally normal. Just cut it back, let it winter out, and then it will come up a little bit late in the spring. It likes to wait until things really warm up, so you won't see it come back often until sometime in April. That's also totally normal. The problem with tropical milkweed is that in a lot of parts of California, especially near the coast, it does not go dormant, right? It stays green year round, which unfortunately allows this disease, it's parasite of monarchs to build up. It's called OE, and the levels of OE get very high in tropical milkweed because it doesn't die back, and the OE will really impact monarch survival. And so and it will also impact the egg laying sort of timing of monarchs. They know and expect milkweed to go dormant at a certain time, and that's their cue. As milkweed starts going dormant, that is their cue to stop laying eggs. So if you have a milkweed plant that doesn't go dormant, often the monarchs will continue laying those eggs, but those eggs will not make it through the winter. So that's really a problem, and that's why we specifically do not recommend the tropical or non-native milkweed.
Okay, it looks like we have probably time for one question.
Yeah, one more.
It's just asking how they would go about contacting their city council about increasing pollinator habitat, and if they had a meeting, if there's a key person or city council, if someone from Xerces could attend and do a presentation and answer questions. I can put the request.
Yeah. So that's a really good question. I honestly, I hate to just pass the buck, but I actually think that Molly Martin, who is our Bee City Bee Campus coordinator, is probably the best person to answer that. We might have something sort of packaged for folks that they could take to a city council meeting, like an outline or, some ideas to go with. I don't know how much capacity we have to support individual Bee City or Bee Campus efforts in terms of like speaking, at city council meetings or things like that. But it's probably at least possible. Certainly if it's local to Sacramento, I would be happy to do it. I don't think I have capacity to do something that's, outside of my immediate area. But again, Molly Martin at Xerces, who's our Bee City Bee Campus coordinator, she might be the best person to talk to about that. All right, thank you, everybody. Take care.